Well, good evening and welcome to part one of Bridging Communities, Reflections of Hope, a dialogue for community leaders, faith leaders, and individuals who care about how we create community in Houston. We want to encourage more people to share their authentic stories with those who desire to listen with compassion and understanding. Thank you for joining us tonight. To help with your experience, we invite you to place your comments in the chat. We will take questions from the chat at the end of the discussion, time permitting. We are here because we want the same thing, to live in a community where we feel safe and are able to go about our lives without being targeted because of how we look. Our panel will reflect on their lived experiences at a time when anti-Asian violence is on the rise all around the nation. As moderators, we will pose questions ranging from setting historical context and including implicit bias, the myth of the model minority, language barriers, and the vastness of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We want to thank our panelists for their willingness to share their stories. We also want to thank our hosts for supporting tonight's event. Covenant Church, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, Faith Leaders Coalition of Greater Houston, Interfaith Ministries for Greater Houston, Korean American Association and Community Center of Houston, Myoken-ji Temple, OCA Greater Houston, Resurrection Metropolitan Community Church. I am Reverend Ellen Denise Junius. I serve on the board of Faith Leaders Coalition of Greater Houston and as the interim pastoral care coordinator at Resurrection MCC. I'm also a senior fellow in the American Leadership Forum. It is my hope that tonight we will inspire you to grow in your compassion and heart for justice. Next, I would like to introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Donna Murphy. She will tell us why tonight is important to her and introduce our panel. Again, welcome.
Thank you so much, Denise. So my name is Donna Murphy. I identify as a Texan, as Hispanoparlante, which is a Spanish speaker, as Korean American. And I say all of these things because they are true, but also because it demonstrates that each of us actually holds multiple identities that often intersect and sometimes are at tension with one another. I've been doing years of advocacy work around immigration and also in racial justice in all of my communities. And that's what brought me into this conversation. With the racialization of the coronavirus and with scapegoating of immigrants over this last year, historic violence directed against our communities, and also deepening health disparities that are based on race. We're in a pivotal moment in my judgment where we have a choice. We're presented with a choice. We can either choose to continue down a path of cultural misunderstanding and of racism, or we can choose to step into courageous conversations to tackle everything that has, in my judgment, gone for too long without being addressed, about how we think about the world, how we inhabit the world, how we move in the world. And that is why I reached out to Denise to begin with, and that was to have these kinds of conversations. I'm really grateful that she also had a similar vision. So I'd like to go ahead and allow each of our panelists today to introduce themselves, maybe just a minute each. And let's go ahead and start with Georgette, and then just pass it along to the others in the panel, if you would.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. My name is Georgette Almonahan, and I serve as a board of director and a staff volunteer for Resurrection Metropolitan Community Church. I was born in Taipei, Taiwan, so I am Taiwanese. I was adopted at 2 days old from an orphanage by an Army family, and they brought me over to the United States. I have never, ever been around other Asian people until this panel, this group. And I am very blessed for the people here that have taken me in, because I have never felt the need until lately with the anti-Asian violence that I needed to work on my identity and work on my Asian heritage. Greg?
Hi, I'm the Reverend Greg Han. I, in shorthand, often introduce myself as a half-Asian, Midwestern-raised, Jesuit-educated, Harvard-trained, Texas-residing Presbyterian minister, and each one of those aspects is important to me and helps define a part of who I am. And I speak really out of a context of being biracial. My father is an immigrant from China. He came here when he was 17 years old. And my mother's side of the family has been here in the United States for generations. And so I'm grateful to be on the panel and to bring, again, whatever perspective I can that can be helpful to addressing anti-AAPI hate. Let me go to Gina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Gina Norm. I'm second generation Korean American, and I'm a pregnancy options counselor at Houston Women's Reproductive Services, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Houston studying mental health counseling. And I decided to join this conversation because I want to be in community with other Asian American people, and I think that there's something really powerful and healing about telling our stories to each other, because we don't get a whole lot of opportunities to do that. And so I hope that for Asian American folks in attendance on this panel who are watching, I hope that seeing us share stories with each other feels like a salve, and I hope it emboldens you to share your stories as well. Miyoke.
Good evening, finally. I'm Miyoke Kane Barrett. I am Japanese and African American. And I guess you could say I was also an immigrant because I was not born in this country and came over with my immigrant mother after the war. And I'm in this conversation because I've always been Asian. I've always been Black. And it's a mixture that most people have not seen and most people don't really understand. And sometimes I don't even understand. But I'm very happy to be with my Asian family here tonight and to be able to share a perspective that is often invisible in these conversations. And I look forward to communing with all of you this evening. So now I will send this off to Hyunja.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Hyunja Norman. Can I hear? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Hyunja Norman. I am a Korean board member of Korean American. I am a first generation Korean immigrant. I came here when I was over 30 years old. I'm because I want to know different Asian American groups, and then I want to tell all Americans we are not different. We are all American, everybody here.
Okay, is that everybody?
We had a little bit of difficulty hearing you, Hyunja, but I think maybe you'd be passing to Fu next.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Fu Lu. I am a theologian, philosopher, artist, and educator. I teach at Episcopal High School. I am a refugee from the Vietnam War, often called in Vietnam the American War. I am Vietnamese American, and I am honored to be here as a part of this panel.
Okay, does that conclude all of our panelists? Great. Okay, well, I'd like to start us off with the first question, or Donna, I think you were going to ask them. Did you have any other questions for the panelists before we get started in our questions?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go ahead and begin then this conversation that's so important. I believe it's really important that you have an opportunity to use your voice and lift your voice and share your lived experiences. And so the first question is, what is your experience being Asian in America? And let's take Fu, if you would start us off.
Yeah, I identify as a Vietnamese American, and several writers, including Vic Thanh Nguyen and Ocean Vuong, have talked about how often that description is in itself problematic. Being a Vietnamese person who, like I said, I'm a refugee from Vietnam because of the war. I'm a product of the war. I also am an American, and so those descriptions, being Vietnamese and American, sometimes don't seem to go together, or might be in conflict because of the history of the Vietnam War. And so my experience, my story growing up was one of how do I lean into being either American or being a Vietnamese person, when often being a Vietnamese person is something that is seen as perpetually foreign in this country, perpetually other. So growing up in the States, I always saw myself as different. I always noticed myself in a room, any kind of room, and for me that caused a lot of internal problems and conflict. I spent my lifetime trying to resolve and reconcile. And so here in this country, it was a matter of trying to figure out, what part of me is American, when being American means being involved in this conflict, a conflict that started actually in 1954 and went on for about 20 years of war in Vietnam, a conflict that took over 2 million Vietnamese lives, and a conflict that took 50,000 American lives, but also on the other side, over 2 million Vietnamese lives. And then just recently, within the past 10 years or so, leaning into the Vietnamese identity, what it meant to be a Vietnamese living in American, when being here was a matter of conflict, was a result of the war. And so throughout my life, I've always been trying to resolve those two things within myself, and every time I'm in a room that's majority white, or that I'm the minority, I mentioned that I am a teacher at a Episcopal high school, and the other day this really struck me as something very very strange, but yet understandable. I am the first person of color hired into the religion department at that school. And so there's been a history of assumed whiteness, especially in my discipline, religion, and that has also perplexed me, where I'm living in a country that purportedly is a sort of quote unquote Christian or Judeo-Christian nation, but has a difficult time knowing God, knowing the divine outside of the culture of whiteness. And so, that entering into that field, that discipline, being a theologian myself, is another sort of area of conflict that I've had to resolve here in this country. So many areas of tension, many areas of conflict, which is sort of the story of my life leading to this point.
So I'm not sure whether others are having this issue, but I can't see you.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I don't know what happened to your camera at some point. Maybe as you're fixing that, we can move on to the next speaker.
Yeah.
And we're at about 6:18 right now, and we're here only till 7:30, right?
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
It's
So
fine.
let's move on, and maybe somebody else. Maybe you can pass it to someone else too. I really appreciated all of your comments there. I feel like there's so much to unpack in that, a lot to think about. Yeah.
Maybe Bishop Miyoke.
Well, my experience as an Asian in America has been largely through my mother, because most people don't know what I am. And so most of my life has been spent with people asking me, what are you? And, how exotic looking I am, or they can't imagine where I come from. And the majority of people who have welcomed me in identity actually have been Filipinos, because they tend to see me as being closer to what they might look like. Hawaiians also. But I grew up on military bases because my father was a career soldier. So there was a lot of hatred throughout my life for my mother, against my mother. And so I would see her verbally attacked, and people telling her to go back to her country because she bombed our troops, like she had done it herself personally. So there was a lot of hatred focused upon people like my mother. And the communities that we interacted with most of the time were other families like ours who were biracial, Japanese and Black families, because there is also in those communities another hierarchy of, white and Japanese, and then Black and Japanese. So they're the same level of whiteness being supreme was part of that equation as well, even as we lived overseas. We lived in Germany, we lived in Okinawa. And so there was not so much mixing among white and Japanese and Black and Japanese. These groups tended to stick together. And so most of my life, I've been the invisible person, because nobody knows what you are. And so some people are afraid to ask you, and some people just make assumptions, and it tends to go on from there. And as I've gotten older, And because I practice a form of Japanese Buddhism and have traveled back and forth to Japan a great deal over the years, I have come to encounter the being excluded from being Japanese by people who are 100% Japanese, and have had people tell me that, oh, so you're Japanese, but only half. And some folks, even here in the States who are Japanese, tend to not accept or welcome me into that community. And it's also the same on the other side of the equation with the African American community. So a lot of times the stories of those of us who are biracial are just, we are invisible. We are outside of all communities. And in essence, we work most of our lives to find a place for ourselves where we can be welcomed. And I'd say for the last 20 years or so, that welcome has been found in communities with other people like me, who are some of the ways we call ourselves are hafus or hapas, and lately I heard another one called Black Nikkei or Blasians. So all of us are trying to find where we belong. And so we're making our own spaces. Let's see, who shall I?
Can I just organically jump in, maybe to
Sure,
segue?
I was thinking about you.
Thank you, Bishop. Because there is a great deal that resonates with me about also the half Asian experience. So to answer again the question, and I'll be brief. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone. What is your experience of being Asian in America? I think I would just like to add that in many ways it's been positive. And I was an American Studies major in college at Georgetown, and I still have great hope in the American experiment. And I think some of that story for me comes from my Chinese father and his siblings, who came to America really looking for the American dream. And my father was retired as a very successful, well loved and well respected physician. And so for me, in many cases, I want to add that the experience has been positive for the kind of the Chinese side of my family, and has contributed a great deal and has given a great deal to my family. I would also I was laughing thinking about in solidarity with Miyoke about it hasn't happened in a while, but especially through my 20s and 30s, it was not uncommon when people would come up to me and say, I don't mean to be rude, which is usually code word where I'm about to be rude, but what are you? And so I very much align with that sense, at least of my biracial experience of living on the lines, living kind of where every community is yours, but no community is yours. And that's perhaps why I've been so attracted to the interreligious and cross-religious engagement work that I do at Interfaith Ministries. And that feeling of, with Asian communities, I'm not quite Asian enough because I never grew up speaking the language. But with white communities, I always feel like a little different as well. So I do want to add that I feel a lot of hope in many cases, but also from just to segue to resonate with what was spoken about, kind of the biracial experience, which I think is more and more an experience that we're seeing as kind of integrated marriages are becoming more and more commonplace. I'll stop there and maybe ask, just again, go to Gina for our next speaker.
Sure. I just want to point out that in everyone's responses so far, we are talking about, our experiences through the lens of what our ethnicities are. Like, the question is, what's your experience of being Asian in America? And Fu talked about being Vietnamese American, and Miyoke talked about being Japanese and Black American. And I think that gets at something really important about the Asian American experience, which is, and what that term even means, which is that it's really nebulous and hard to speak to in this kind of broad way. And that's something that I really relate to. Like, I think that I knew I was Korean and knew what that meant before I knew that I was Asian and knew what that meant. Like, it's hard for me to separate what part of my experience is the Asian experience, as opposed to the experience of being a Korean American woman, of having immigrant parents, of being the only person of color in a lot of the spaces that I grew up in. And I didn't really develop like my political consciousness as an Asian American person until pretty recently. And so when I think about that question, I think about how I and a lot of us are, we find ourselves questioning and wrestling with the terminology and language that we use to describe us, because like, who is us? On the one hand, it's just language, but also language is super important because it's how we define our condition. It's how we define who we are, how we situate ourselves in our struggles. And it's about who we're including and excluding and who belongs. So yeah.
Hanja, would you like to take on that question as well? Okay, Hanja, we're having trouble with your mic again. I'm sorry.
Mhm.
Okay, there you
As
go.
a first, now, as a first generation Korean American immigrant, my experience in America has been hindered by my limited English.
We lost your video.
Okay, I'm sorry, I cannot start video because the host had stopped it. I cannot control my video here.
Okay, while we, there you go. Okay, we can see you now.
I'm very sorry. Okay. While I have successfully functioning with the American community, I have at times prepared to engage with the Korean community. I experienced many problems navigating the American educational and then economic and social political institutions. But I got help from my husband and my children. I did not have textbook on how to live in America when I come here. So I have to learn by trial and error. I learned I learned to observing how other people act. I could have not said much because I did not make any mistakes in front of other people. And I could have been quiet and kept my head down and did not make movies. But however, this is not my personality. So I did not follow the crowd. Yes, I did not fit actually Asian American stereotype. So I have to be myself. And so I have to do what I think is right. Yeah. Next one, George.
Yes, I didn't grow up in an Asian environment or family. So what I can equate my Asian experience to when I was little, my sister and I, who was full-blood Chinese, was also adopted. We were the only kids that were Asian in the school. And I don't know why I was picked on, but people would throw rocks at me. I had girls pick me up by my heels and try to put me in the toilet. I didn't understand why they would do something like that. Teachers would come by with pictures and say, hey, this is what you look like. And in my adult life, I've been in lines like at grocery stores, and they would say next, and they would say, no, not you, the person behind you. And so I never talked to anybody about this. I thought, well, maybe it's my imagination, but when it happens 2 and 3 and 4 times, it makes you wonder what's going on. So I say that's my Asian experience in America. Back to you, Donna.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I wish we could spend like another half hour talking about the responses that you all gave. What I will say is that I think that, you know, our understanding as people who are, I guess, Asian in heritage, I guess racially Asian in heritage, but who are like either born or have immigrated to the United States and are living here. So much of it is shaped by like the dominant narratives, which are scripted by people who are white, right? And I think a lot of what was shared tonight reflects that and the challenges of grappling with that reality. Yeah, so yeah, I won't go into it more. I do think that, so one of those things that I wanted to mention here, because I'm not sure that it would come up otherwise explicitly, is the model minority myth, right? So it's like the white understanding of being Asian as like a desirable thing, because we're kind of rendered as like hardworking, you know, we're successful because we put in the work and we're smart. And I think a lot of people don't understand how problematic that myth actually is. And I think, you know, now it's particularly relevant, and I think it becomes particularly obvious that that myth does not protect us, right? Because we have historic amounts of violence against people who look Chinese, right? Because of the ways in which this virus has been racialized. And so the next question that I actually wanted to pose to the group has to do with that, and that is, how do you feel, or how has the recent violence against Asian Americans affected you? And I will start this time maybe with Miyoke.
Thank you. Well, frankly, I'm a bit excluded from that. But what I find is the level of anxiety that I remember experiencing as a child when people would attack my mother, because my mom is 90 years old now. And so I worry about her every day, and she's out in California. And I just pray every day that she remains safe. That, you know, I told her today, I hope you're not going out by yourself. And if you are, carry a baseball bat and be prepared to be like that Chinese lady and start beating up on the folks who try to hurt you. Because she's pretty tough. So that part of it, the constant worry for my mom, something that's with me every day.
And Miyoke, thank you for sharing that. I feel that it's not exactly the same, because I'm actually not personally worried about my parents, because you know, the folks who've been most at risk for being the targets of these kinds of attacks are the elderly and people who live at the intersections of, like, you know, being working class or poor and not speaking English well, with different immigration statuses. And but at the same time, seeing and hearing about those attacks every time just fills me with such grief and rage, and a feeling of helplessness. Like, part of me understands why these attacks are happening. Like, it has to do with, you know, hateful, fearful rhetoric about pandemic, etc. But I also don't understand why it's happening. Like, it just feels so senseless and out of control. I also want to specify that like right now we're talking about the spike in violence against, you know, people who are East Asian, people who look East Asian or Chinese, and you know, those attacks have been spurred on by the rhetoric about the pandemic. But there's also been recent attacks on South Asians and Southeast Asians, and they're also part of the Asian American community. So I just wanted to name that before I continue. I wanted to talk briefly about the grief I felt after the Atlanta shootings, because I'm still not over it. Like, I wept and couldn't stop for days. I would just like cry in public at the drop of a hat. And that reaction really surprised me. I was like, I don't know these people. Like, why am I feeling such a personal grief about it? And I think it's because that shooting and the initial media narrative around it struck a really deep nerve within me, having grown up as an Asian American girl in a church that was steeped in a white patriarchal purity culture that problematizes our bodies, like women's bodies, and especially the bodies of women of color, that tells us that our bodies are somehow, that we're the problem, we're responsible for other people's misbehavior. And, you know, as an adult living as an Asian woman in a society that objectifies us, and the logical result of such a culture is that we are seen as disposable because our bodies are seen as disposable. And so the recent attacks have brought all of that to the surface for me, and I'm still, you know, working through a lot of it.
Wow. I think the pause is just to absorb just a lot of the insight, Gina, that you've offered. So thank you. I think I want to just reflect on a couple of the questions that Gina has asked about defining what Asian is, and I think we've talked about that as a group in a couple of our preparatory meetings. Is that South Asian? Is it East Asian? How far kind of west does it be, and does it go? And in some ways, the challenge of how race is. And I often talk about this when I teach world religions, when we talk about Western religions and Eastern religions and who gets to define that. And it often has been kind of, again, a Western academic approach. So, and then I sometimes, to get to the question of how's the recent violence against the AAPI community affected you, for me, it's challenged me to think about kind of what I've missed, what's been internalized, the questions that I've been forced to ask myself of what sort of Asian am I? Do I consider myself a person of color? Because in many cases, when I think about the recent violence, to get to the question of part of it, I feel deeply affected as I think about my Chinese side, and do I worry necessarily about my father and my stepmother and my half brother? Not necessarily, but do I worry about the people that they represent in the Asian community? Yes. But on the other hand, reflecting on Miyoke, I've also been insulated because I can pass. And many people who are biracial have that opportunity. And so I think about it in solidarity, but personally, I'm conflicted in my own experience. So for me, the recent violence has definitely forced me to ask questions of my own experience that I haven't had to necessarily ask before. And I'll stop there and turn to Fu.
Yeah, I have since last year at the start of the pandemic been tracking the rising number of hate crimes towards Asians here in the United States, and it's just unbelievable. And still, whenever I see it each day, it just breaks my heart. Sometimes I just can't go on, and I have to take a break from it. I often want to say that this is not the American way. This is not how to be American. But at the same time, I'm forced to say that this is very American, that this is at the heart of how America has defined itself with the violence against Asian Americans. And so it just breaks my heart, and trying to figure out a way forward it's just a long road for me. George?
Okay. I feel like we've asked this question before, and I feel a little different. I take it personally. I internalize whenever I hear the president say this is a Chinese disease or the Chinese caused it, or when I hear the attack on Pearl Harbor, or I hear that there are riots and it's the Asians that are doing it. I am scared to death myself. I don't know where that comes from, and I don't know what to do with it, but I am scared to death. And I feel like I'm silently suffering inside. And I'm afraid to go out sometimes. I'm afraid just because of the way I look. And of course, there's a lot of other people out there with the same feelings, but all I can tell you is how I feel, and that's how I feel. I'm scared to death that something will happen to me. Hi, Jeff. I think it's.
Thank you, George. Korean American. So for me, Korean American matters are very important. Okay, but this violence against Asian American really wake me up. I am Korean American, but I am also Asian American. I needed to borrow from Gina's article. The attackers, they do not see, for their eyes, we are all same. They do not know we are Korean. They do not know we are Chinese, but we look same. That kind of things really wake me up. And also I really worried about our community, because I work with many seniors, and then with many people do not speak good English. When things happen, how they can depend and explain what happened to them. That kind of things really worry about me. And then, so I just, I want to do something about it. That's why I came here.
Thank you for sharing. I believe we may have covered all the panelists on that question. Donna, would you like to prompt the next question?
Yeah, absolutely. So we wanted to ask you all about how racial or ethnic divisions have affected you all. I mean, I guess in specific reference to what's going on now, or more generally, that would be fine to comment on that. And maybe here we can start with Fu.
Yeah, I think it does relate back to the question of both the Asian American experience here, and also the experience of violence lately. I have seen multiple times of violence from those within the Black community towards people who are Asian Americans, and to me it just it's a deep ache. I really can't understand that kind of violence when the Black community has itself underwent a lot of violence itself. And so a lot of times I think it is a matter of perception somehow, because of a cultural whiteness that we live in. There is a value system, like who gets the most value, who is undervalued, who is to blame for certain problems, certain woes. Is the collapse of our economy the fault of the coronavirus, and therefore the fault of the Chinese? And so here we are to blame. And so that kind of scapegoating, that kind of violence, it tears me apart, because I feel like a lot of my work is trying to do reconciliation work, to understand, to know, to bridge the differences, which are really all perceived differences, and how can we work through those perceptions, and that's a difficult question for me. Gina?
Yeah, I was about to jump in because I think, well, first I want to speak to the fact that right now, at this very moment, there is an Asian American hate crimes meeting with local law enforcement that's happening right now. And I think it's really important for us as a community to call it out when we see responses to these attacks that are inherently anti-Black, like calling for more policing in our neighborhoods as if that's a solution to violence, as if that's going to lead to less violence. And I think it's important for us to resist being used as a tool of white supremacy that pits us against other people of color. So I wanted to say that first. And then I think more broadly, I think that, for me, and I think for a lot of us, just the idea of like trying to overcome these divisions and tensions and misunderstandings between Asian Americans and other racial groups, and also even just divisions like within Asian America, like the divisions between our different ethnicities and nationalities, because that's real, like that's definitely a thing. I think that can feel, I feel like sad and overwhelmed sometimes when I think about it. It can feel really daunting. But I think that if we stay curious about what those tensions are really about and make an effort to build real relationships with each other, I actually don't think that we need to be so afraid of confronting those divisions, especially when there's so much collective power to be gained.
Thank you very much, Gina. Hyunja, I'm really curious actually to hear your answer in response to Gina, because I think you and I have had conversations about this very often with things that have happened recently, and we've done a lot of work together. So what are your thoughts?
Okay. I didn't think about much America. Okay, here in America, I have to identify my race every time. So also can you hear me? So I live a very segregated society. So I attended to my husband. So also my work is helping our community, because I speak our own language and share our own culture. Because this, I tend to pay attention only to my community affairs and our own interest. So, but I realized that only we cannot achieve a lot of things just only when I work in our community. So I have to work with other community together to achieve our common interests. So these questions really make me think. Racial divides and ethnic divides really divide us. Okay. It does not unite us, and this is not good for America whole country. That's what I'm thinking. And then,
sorry, Miyoke or Greg, I'm also really curious to hear now from your perspective being biracial, what your thoughts are on racial and ethnic divisions, particularly in the United States, and your experience of that being kind of, you know, in those liminal spaces, right?
Yeah. Miyoke, you want to start? I always love to be able to build on and reflect on what you've on your insights.
One of the things I always think about and have even discovered much lately is I think there's some kind of loss, particularly in the Black, of not having a culture, you know, not having history, not having things that come to them from ancient times. And some of, you know, especially Asian communities are so old and the cultures have come down generation to generation. And so there's, I think in some sense, for some folks, a kind of maybe envy and just such a difference, you know, because I have heard recently people say, well, you grew up in a culture that was part of your home and, you know, it comes from a long time and I don't have that, you know, and it was really quite surprising to me because I had not heard that before. But I also think that we live in a system that others people so much that it's very difficult for us to come together. And in particular, the Korean and Black community, because of all the beauty shops and all of those things over time that have been seen to have given preferential treatment to one community over another, even though we know that's not true. But I think it's difficult for people to see beyond their own pain, to see that the pain might also be the same in another community. And that's what I think is so important about us talking to each other. You know, nobody knows more than our communities how difficult it is to self-identify each other. You know, Japanese can maybe tell a Chinese or a Vietnamese, you know, there's always, how do you know one Asian from another? You can't, it's you know, you have to really be steeped into it to be able to do that. And so to have everybody lumped together makes the difficulty happen, you know, because each of those communities brings with it their own prejudices and divisions. And so we have all of this based on, especially here in this country, that all of us have been harmed by our racial conditioning. All of us. None of us can escape it. All of us have been exposed to, educated in, living in systems of white supremacy without even being aware of it. And so it's a very difficult thing for us to unpack and find a way to overcome in such a way so that we can interact with each other as equals. You know, all of us undergoing the same type of situation. I have children running. And trying to come together so that we can make a better place for all of us. And I think that's just something we're going to have to keep working at and keep talking to each other and engaging in ways like this.
And the children running in the background is a wonderful reminder of why we do this work as well. How have racial and ethnic divisions affected you? I think they've affected me deeply, but sometimes people will necessarily see that, or I don't admit it to myself. And maybe that's a little bit of a segue also into the next question about stereotypes, about kind of that, at least from my experience, that kind of Confucian stoicism, that we don't talk about our feelings as a stereotype. And so, and for me, it happened recently in that I spoke up about this anti-AAPI hate and how it was affecting me. And a friend of mine who knows me well from a couple of contexts said, I never really thought about that because you just seem to flow from community to community so easily. And that's, again, I think part of my what are you sort of situation. But I think it's affected me because, again, the one other again, we're all of these wonderful complexities, but the other part is I'm trained as a pastor, and to be present to people's suffering. And sometimes the hardest suffering for me to be present to is my own, and I'll leave it at that. But then I would also say that it's affected me because, again, I've looked back and trying to be a historian, thinking about, well, wait, this hate against the AAPI community just didn't emerge in the last year or 2 years or 4 years, but it's the tip of an iceberg. Why is my father, who is clearly Chinese, listed as white on my birth certificate? I always pondered that, and even more and more so over the last few years. When did I realize? I heard a wonderful question in light of the murder of George Floyd on a panel from UH Law School about when did you first realize you had a race? And I just thought that was a deeply insightful question. And for me, I think about it as, well, when I looked in the mirror almost every day and I saw a piece of my father and a piece of my mother. And then, of course, when I first heard the first time I was called an ethnic slur as in elementary school, and I just wasn't sure what to do with that other than it hurt. So I think what is happening now, I'm both present to, but I also has both forced me and given me an opportunity to think about the past and to realize that where we are now just is the product of not just a year or 4 years or 5 years, but many years.
Definitely so. I was really struck, and I was thinking about you, Gina, because we did a National Buddhist Memorial Service for the victims in Atlanta. And it was so beautiful because it was every Buddhist lineage that we could draw together, and from the East and South Asian, all of us together memorializing these folks as part of our family. And I'm also reflecting with Hunja, because when she talks about having her husband and her children help her, because I remember going to the grocery store with my mother, writing out checks for her because she didn't know how to spell the amounts of the money, all of those kinds of precious memories. But they also speak to being different from other kids who haven't had to navigate the world for their parents. Thank you, Greg, for reminding me.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to comment quickly that I really appreciate, I think Miyoke and Greg in particular alluded to history and the importance of situating ourselves in history, because we're often taught in schooling in the United States anyway. And I think that this is probably true of a lot of places in the world, because it's a way, honestly, of maintaining control over your people, is to not teach them their history, right? Is to conceive of each person in this country as being ahistorical, and being somebody that you can teach to be what you want them to be, which allows governments to control their people, right? And that has been really problematic here, because our government in particular started off with a particular demographic in power, and over time what this country looks like has changed. And we're a democracy, and so increasingly our democracy is reflecting that change. And I think that that has become challenging for the structures that are in place to maintain the power, right, of those who were in power for a very long time. And yeah, so I really appreciate you all both mentioning that, because it's so important. And I think some of what emerges in these conversations is kind of a collective consciousness of what that history is as we actively construct it together, because we're denied that information, right? But we can figure it out together. So thank you so much for all of your contributions. It's been wonderful. I'm going to pass it back to Denise. Thanks.
Yeah, and I was wondering if George or someone who has not had an opportunity to respond to that last question, if you'd like to feel free to.
Okay, sure. I listen to everybody on this panel, and I feel like, and I might be wrong, but I feel like you've had families to bounce some of this stuff off of. And I've been all alone in my growth. So some of these questions like, how has racial or ethnic divisions affected you? All I know is I internalize, and I feel like I've been second or third class for whatever reasons, but I never have talked to anybody or had brothers or sisters or family to talk with us about. So since I didn't grow up Asian, I have never been sure or thought of where I belonged or who I identified with. So this is kind of difficult for me to hear, and I feel like I'm an orphan out here, because I don't have a lot of your thoughts and feelings and emotions, and I feel like less than. And I know I'm not, but I just feel like that.
Yeah, I can certainly appreciate your comments, George. And I wonder sometimes about the experiences of other children who were adopted and how that experience may parallel in some ways. Hanja, did you want to chime in on this particular question? Okay. So Donna, I really appreciate you sort of setting that frame around the historical context. And so the question that I have for the panel, and we've talked a little bit about this in terms of the myth of the model minority. I'm curious about what ways have stereotypes of being Asian played out in your life? Not only the myth of the model minority, but just some of the other stereotypes that you are very in tune with. Just how has all that played out in your life? And so while the panel is about to respond to that question, I would invite those who are participating to put comments or questions in the chat, and we'll take those right after the panelists have responded to my question. Okay, Gina, would you like to start?
Sure. So like you alluded to, there are a lot of stereotypes about Asian people. And I sort of think of it being like a cast of characters, because there are different stereotypes about Asian women, about Asian men, poor Asian people, rich Asian people. But I think what all of them have in common is that they strip us of our humanity and flatten us. But for me, like, the model minority myth has definitely been the most salient one in my life, especially growing up and going to school and then going to college. For a long time, I felt like the only way that I could be a legitimate or valid or worthy person as an Asian American was if I, performed academically and pursued a career with a lot of prestige and didn't rock the boat socially or politically. And the result that had was that it really took a toll on my mental health, because I was denying myself of my full humanity. And obviously, as you can tell during this panel, I've let go of a lot of those stereotypes and expectations. But I do think that they're always going to occupy some part of my inner voice, just because, you know, they've been there since childhood when my brain was developing and I was becoming a person. I was forming my sense of self, forming my ideas about how the world works and what my place is in it. But the important part is that they're not the only voices anymore, nor are they the most important. You know, I've come to a point where I've decided that that stuff doesn't belong to me. It was imposed upon me.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'd like for Fu and Miyoke to also respond to that question.
I'll give you an example of how I don't meet Asian stereotypes because I didn't have my camera working for some time. Okay, you know, growing up, I lived somewhat in those ideas that you know, Asians are good at math, good at computers, you know, so on and so forth. I myself sort of shun those things because even though my father was an accountant and wanted me to perhaps pick up on his career and continue that line of work, I had no interest in numbers, and I loved ideas. I went to school, did a MA in philosophy. I did a PhD and a MDiv in theology. I love art. I paint. I'm an artist. I love humor. And there's a lot of things that I've lived out, lived in, that perhaps don't necessarily mesh with the idea of the Asian man who, you know, who is, like Greg said, you know, stoic, who is non-effectual. And I love art. I love beauty. I love to express myself in my clothing, in my writing, and so I've always had to work against that. The stereotype of how I should be and how I should act, and what I perceive my identities are, and so it again. I started off with conflict, and I continue to speak about this conflict.
Thank you. As I would say, artistic is very Asian. I think one of the stereotypes about Asians, especially being a female, was the exoticism and submissive nature of Asian women, and the whole sexual thing. And because that's one of the things that I can recall when I was younger, especially encountering that so often, that I would have situations where, especially since I was in the military and myself in the Navy, and was perceived to be Filipino. And so there's Filipino women have a reputation in the Navy. And so it was a battle constantly, because you were allegedly not supposed to say no to these great, powerful men, and you were supposed to be at their beck and call. And so that was with me for a long time, and also with both my sisters, because we often talk about that part of being Asian, that people see you very differently, like you don't have a mind, that you're only a vessel for male pleasure, and you dare not say no because your life is in danger if you do that. So that was something that took quite a while to get over, you know, to really be able to stand up and say, no, we're not working your way. This is my way, you know. and to really be able to, I was lucky my father taught me how to box at an early age. So I was very grateful for that part of my upbringing. But I see that even today, that Asian women in particular are very much sexualized, exoticized, and perceived to be easy, you know, and so that's why you should have one, because they're good and submissive.
And could I say on the other side of that, that a lot of times Asian men have been made to be asexual beings, have been sort of, you watch movies, most movies with Asian men, they're behind computers. They're not the romantic lead. We only have had one American Asian movie where the Asian males, you know, are romantic characters, and that's not been a dominant story that we've heard.
And I've noticed so much lately now, they're showing pictures of hot Asian men, you know, so that people can actually see that, you know, Asian men can be attractive, just like everybody else.
Where was that 20 years ago?
Yeah. Hanja, would you like to chime in on this question?
Okay. Oh, stereotype of Asian American.
Yeah.
I do not know. Just for me, anyone like that. So maybe I didn't have that kind of experience. Okay, but in our community, as Asian American, I have to be quiet. And then some obedient to seniors and husband, but that's not how I raised up. So that's not me. Okay, so it's very difficult to talk about Asian American stereotype for me, because this is not who I am. Maybe Greg, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, one of the troubles with stereotypes is that they have enough truth in them to have a level of traction, and so that makes them all the more pernicious. And recognizing that it's something that we all do, we tend to have to put people in boxes to try to define people. I think it's just a little bit of human nature to try to make sense of the world, and I think part of the expanding diversities and also either the sharing or the claiming of power from certain communities is difficult, because it's forcing certain groups to reimagine their boxes and who belongs where. So I think that's one of the issues with stereotype. I think I had one other thought on. I think the other challenge for people, for groups who aren't in the mainstream, then, that stereotypes cause, is that there's a certain, you know, if you're kind of in the mainstream part of a culture, the path is the many paths that are acceptable are pretty easy to find. And when you're not, those paths are a little bit harder. You have to kind of make your own path, because the path isn't as easily identified if you're kind of a newcomer into a community. And stereotypes just make that all the harder. How have stereotypes played out? You know, some of them are easy sort of to intellectualize. As I think about my father's very, you know, the stoicism, we don't rock the boat. We don't We don't share our emotions. I grew up playing the violin. I went to really good colleges and really blew the stereotype out of the water when my father, who I love dearly and have a wonderful relationship, he wanted me to be, and this is in the 90s, he wanted me to be a businessman, learn Chinese, and be part of opening up the Pacific Rim to business. And he was right on. If I had to follow that, I wouldn't be on this panel. I would be retired about 15 years ago. But I followed a passion of mine, which was theology and humanities. I'm a poster child for the humanities in many ways. So, and some of them just actually, in some ways, are deeply emotional. It happens to me in these ways. It was so petty and so minor and lasted about 30 seconds. But I was in college and I was in Ocean City, Maryland on the boardwalk, beautiful evening with friends, and came up to kind of one of those carnival style events. And I forget what the event was or what the game was, but the person working it started feigning kung fu and making stereotypical Asian sounds. Of doing karate. And I should have forgotten that 30 years ago. But it's those things like that that are so strange in the mind that I can rationalize so many sorts of these stereotypes and see them again and not accept them and see how pernicious they are. But then you run into those events like that, and maybe we all have those that just stick in our head for for every stupid reason other than they stick in your head and make you feel less than.
Yeah, thank you for that. I believe that everyone has shared in that comment and on that question rather, and I do want to read from the chat where Jody has said thank you so much for your vulnerability and how honored she is to hear from everybody and your gratefulness, and she's very grateful that you are willing to share your experiences. And so I'll invite more comments and questions from the chat. And before we do, if there's anyone else who has other comments that you want to make before we move on to the last question for this evening. Okay. All right. So thank you for that. So Donna, we'll turn it over to you to pose a last question. And that comment was actually from Laura Mayo at Covenant Church.
George, I think you have a question.
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment. Through this panel and talking the last 3 or 4 weeks, I have had 2 people come forward and said they would share a family celebration with me. 2 people, and I don't know, that has made me so excited that 2 people have come forward and said, George, you can spend a Christmas family with me, and you can, the other one said you can spend the annual Chinese and thing with her family. And I think that's so precious. I've never been exposed to that, and it's something I've always wanted to do. And so I just want to thank folks for that.
Hey, Donna, it appears we have a question in the chat.
Yes, so this question is from Ashley Della Giacomo. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What is one core thing that you hope that people would know about who you are and your identity?
I think I would like for just to be like everybody else, that, and it's the old cliche, don't judge a book by its cover, because what you see outside is not necessarily who I am. And I think that's true for all of us, that we all have ideas about who people are by how they look, but it says nothing about the depth and the breadth of their experiences in life and where they've traveled. And that's what I would like to see more of in the world.
Yeah, I'd like to share this. We are different. Our destiny is shared here as American. Okay, but Korean American, Asian American, or Chinese American, Japanese American.
I think for me, and I think to say that we have a common experience, but also individual experiences, and that we are people of two worlds, that we're proud of all of those worlds, and in many ways we're trying to figure out those worlds, and that we'd invite people along on the journey with us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for your answers. A great question. So we wanted to just kind of wrap up here with a couple of questions for our panelists, just kind of in summary. So my first question is, what have you found to be valuable in these conversations? And what's motivating that question is that we hope that the conversations that we've had inspire others who are listening to create these kinds of opportunities also within their communities and between communities. And we're here also to be resources for that. I think Denise can share our email addresses. This has taken quite a bit of organization on Denise's part, but it can be done for sure. And I think it's important that we have the discussions. So anyone here, if you want to share your answers to that question, again, the question is, what have you found to be valuable in these conversations?
I think knowing that I'm not alone and that the experiences I have are common among other folk that I never thought I would feel welcome with. And so I feel like in many respects that it's a homecoming. And I really appreciate that.
Go ahead, George.
Yeah, this is actually my first Asian experience. And so it's like I'm a little bird that fell out of a tree, and there's a bunch of little mama birds down there taking hold of me and saying, I'm okay. I mean, I've never been around this many Asians before in my life. And it's been just wonderful. And everybody here has been so sweet and nice and everything. So I just want to thank the panel and Denise and you, Donna, for putting this together and bringing this together. And I want to thank the people who are out there listening to us, because we're all in this together. We're all in this together, and we need to be together. So thank you.
Yeah, George, what I'm hearing you say in your response is that doing this, sharing our stories with each other and listening to one another and bearing witness to each other's experiences strengthens our feelings of belonging with one another. And I think what's valuable about that for me is that that's the place we need to start from if we're going to be effective at addressing the issues that we face as a community. Is I think I'm a big believer in being like really relationship oriented when it comes to tackling these issues. And so George, you spoke to that so beautifully. So thank you for sharing.
I recently watched a PBS documentary about Angel Island in California, where many Chinese immigrants and Asian immigrants went through when they first came to the United States, as a sort of parallel to when European immigrants went to Ellis Island in New York. And the thing that came to mind was the value of story. We've all got a chance to tell our stories here, and I just really value that, because I believe that if we don't tell our stories, then someone else might tell a story about us that may or may not be truthful to who we are, to our experiences. And so I really value the stories that have been shared today.
This conversation is very interesting, and also it's very nice to meet other than Koreans every day. And then share our experience. Also asking difficult questions. I did not think about much race and ethnicity and then discrimination, but this one really, I really had to think about the violence against Asian American, and then racism toward the colored people. So I think that is I really appreciate in this panel.
I know that we're striving to be done on time. I wanted to comment that we did have one question in the chat that was kind of a policy question, but it does speak to whether we think what our government is doing in our name is actually impacting our ability to be who we want to be in the world, right? Like, and this was in specific reference to policy with China. I think this is a bigger conversation, but what I will say to this is why these kinds of conversations are so important, because we're ultimately the people who decide on the people who govern us, right? And if they are creating problems abroad or domestically, we have agency in changing that. And I think that the way we come to an understanding of that I think is inclusive is by gathering people in community like this. And I will also admit, like we have a tremendous amount of diversity on the stage here, but there are still people who are not here, and namely, we don't have South Asians represented here, right? And so there are certainly other axes of diversity we may not have also included. And I think this is why we have to keep having these kinds of conversations. And that's why we're also encouraging others to follow in this kind of model. Yeah. Any other comments from our panelists? And then I think maybe Denise had one other question and she'll wrap us up.
I just want to say real quickly to go off of you, Donna, and it's just that idea of when our leaders in government talk about communist China, and we know that there are human rights abuses done by communist China, even communist Vietnam. A lot of times, though, it's hard for the average American to separate the Chinese government from Chinese people. And when our leaders are not crystal clear as how they delineate that, that's where we do need to push back on that and make that clarification, or else there will be continued violence, continued hatred, continued scapegoating of Asian Americans in this country.
Okay, thank you for that. So on that note, and I hope you've all had an opportunity to chime in on that last question around what you found valuable in this conversation. Greg, did we hear from you before we go to the last question?
Much has been said. I think the thing for me that's most important is that I've seen, again, just ironically, that for me, the kind of the Asian community for me, again, ironically, has been the one that I've had the most trouble getting to know. And the message for me is that the Asian community wants to be known. And again, in that monolithic way, but just that we want people to come to get to know us.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I just want to ask Miyoke and Fu if you could address this, and possibly Hanja, just for the sake of time. What words of wisdom do you want to leave with the individuals who have taken out time to hear your stories tonight? We are so grateful for the fact that they've taken the time, but we're also really grateful that you all are here sharing your stories. So Miyoke, Fu and Hanja, what wisdom do you want to leave?
I would say just be curious, and thank you for the curiosity that brought you here this evening. It's not easy to get to know each other. And the more that we reach out and ask questions, be curious and, introspective ourselves to learn about someone that we don't know anything about. It's very important.
Thank you.
I would say, as a theologian, I'll speak as a theologian, that to see the divine in all of us, a lot of times because my theology informs me that all of us are made in the image of the divine. And if we can sit down and start from that place where I see you as divine, as godlike, and if you don't see that, then I may encourage that or empower that. Then I can see that reflected in myself. So insofar as we can do that for others, we acknowledge and see that in ourselves.
Okay, and Hanja, we know you've had trouble with your microphone, so I'm really hoping that you can have the last word here without any issues.
Okay.
Okay, now we can hear you.
We speak, we look different, but we also speak differently. But I think we love to be an American. So we want to be an American. That's what I want to say.
Well, we definitely heard that last phrase, and thank you so much. I just want to say thank you to all of you for being willing to share your stories, to be vulnerable, and to reflect back on your experiences. This has been so important and also historic in so many ways. I also want to say thank you to my co-moderator, Donna, for supporting this event. And I know that there are many, many conversations that we still need to have. And so we intend to continue having those conversations. And we in the future, we'll be discussing conversations with other civic leaders and business leaders and other individuals in the community. Again, thank you to all the panel. Thank you to Donna, as I said. Thank you to all the participants, all of you who took the time to share in your time with us. We also want to thank Reverend Troy Tresh, who's been supporting us in the background with technology, and John Merriweather, who also helped to set up the webinar for us. So again, this event would not be possible without your willingness as a panel to share your stories. And so we, again, want to end on that note and just say thank you so, so much. And we look forward to another time together. Good night, everyone.